I have to say it's quite exciting to continually be asked by the Canadian Army to talk to them about emotions. I have to say I never thought I would see that day where they keep asking me to do more research and talk to them more about the role of emotions in optimum human performance. And so I want to talk a bit about what do we mean by resilience and what role do emotions play in that. And to give you an example, today, coming here, I could experience a variety of emotions. I could experience some fear at the possibility of messing up in front of people. I might be embarrassed if I don't know the answer to a question. I could feel guilty for being away from my family, but I got over that a while ago. I could have anxiety about trying to remember everything I'm going to say and try to say it all in 15 minutes. Or I could be excited about contributing to the dialogue. So it's all about recognizing that we experience a myriad of emotions, deciding, well, first of all, being able to identify what they are, then deciding what am I going to do with them. How do I choose to participate and take the risks that I've just talked about? And do I take the opportunity to grow? Because we've talked about how despite all of the challenging experiences that we go through, the norm is resilience. We grow, we develop, we learn about ourselves. And it's not the narrative that we read in the newspaper that, you know, military service breaks us and leaves us, you know, not good to do anything else for the rest of our lives. We're all here today because we chose to do what we're doing, and we have grown and learned over the years how to become more capable, more resilient, more adaptable. And so we need to remember that it's not just about the cognitive processes and the physical processes, but how do we leverage our emotions to modulate the human stress response? Because positive and negative emotions each have a place. Positive emotions will broaden our perspective. They can widen our scope of thought, allow for more flexible attention in our environment, which is important in a lot of the jobs that we do. And they support more adaptive coping. But negative emotions have their place as well. They narrow our attention, enhance our critical thinking, and they're important when we need an eye for detail in many of the tasks that we do. And why is this important? In our society, we take in about 39 gigabytes of information in a day. That's enough to crash a laptop in a week. We have 60,000 thoughts a day. We talk to ourselves at a rate of 300 to 1,000 words a minute, and most of them are negative. We have a negativity bias, simply because our ancestors who didn't have a negativity bias did not survive to pass their genes on to us. When they sat in the shade saying, "Oh, I'm sure that noise behind us is nothing," you understand how that went. So our hypervigilance, our paranoia, has been important in the survival of the human race. 47% of the time, we are not paying attention to what we are actually doing, which is quite dangerous in many different regards. And our greatest human need is to connect with others, which demands a significant amount of emotional awareness and emotional intelligence. So as General Aitchison has pointed out, we've institutionalized resilience training in the CAF over the last 9 years. And we do it in a cyclical fashion based on prepare, perform, recover. So we give people the knowledge and training to understand the stress response and manage the stress response. So General Palmer, when you talked yesterday about all the stuff about the amygdala and cortisol and adrenaline and dopamine and oxytocin, when we first started developing this, I was overwhelmed by how much the troops loved that information and how much they wanted to know more about it. Because again, if we can understand what's going on, we can better anticipate our response and learn strategies to manage it. The performance and skill application is key. The Big 4+, they're all cognitive behavioral therapy skills that we borrowed from the US Navy SEALs several years ago. But the recovery piece is also important. And this is one that I don't think we value very highly in modern society, but we are not designed to function at our optimal performance level indefinitely without having recovery time. And we could take some lessons from elite athletes who have performance cycles. They know when they have to be at the top of their game, and so they actually schedule what they need to do to get to that point. And they don't ever think that they can, perform the way they would in the Stanley Cup playoffs 365 days a year. So we need to think about how we build recovery into our daily routines, micro-recovery. Take a deep breath every time the phone rings. Get up and walk around the office every hour. Between meetings, take a few deep breaths. Take some time to deal with what we just experienced, center ourselves, and then prepare to go again. A routine at the end of the day, so that as we're driving home or walking home, we're recovering from our day and then preparing to deal with the demands of our personal lives and our home lives. So building in recovery on an ongoing basis is critical for our ability to function at our optimal level over the long term. So we've built the training in progressively and developmentally. When I first came into the job over 9 years ago, thankfully nobody told me that in 9 years you need to build this. When I started, we had 2 courses we developed and delivered, so basic training and the primary leadership qualification. We currently have over 35 different courses, and we continue to develop and tailor and adapt to different occupations and different environments, because again, each different target audience will have very specific needs. So for SOF, they developed a SOF-specific package that it meets the needs of that environment, but it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of new pilots coming in to do pilot training in Moose Jaw. Very, very different environments, as we heard this morning from the commander. And this can't be a one-time intervention. We can't just give somebody an inoculation when they join and assume that they're good to go for 30 years. So we teach them what they need to know at that time, and then we continually build on it and make it progressive and developmental, becoming more complex as they increase in rank and responsibility and take on different roles. We spend a fair amount of time explaining the how and why. So all of the science behind what happens when we perceive something in our environment, what happens with the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the adrenal glands, all of that. I'm not going to go into all of that detail, but we stress the importance of understanding that when we get further to the right on the Yerkes-Dodson performance curve at the bottom, it affects our ability to use our frontal cortex and make decisions, to communicate. We can't tolerate ambiguity when we're just past our optimal performance zone. So our brain will push us to make a decision. It does not care what that decision is. It just wants black or white so that it can relax and move on. We don't have our best ideas when we're highly stressed. We're much more easily distracted, and we perceive all incoming information as a threat and don't communicate our intent very well. So the importance of teaching some skills to manage that physiological arousal so that we can actually make better decisions and perform our roles better. So just highlighting the Big 4+, the US Navy SEALs started with the Big 4. They now have the Big 7, but we didn't want to keep changing the numbers, so we just have the Big 4+, and we add or subtract, again, depending on what the needs of the target audience are. So getting people to focus on their performance objectives through goal setting, which in moments of fear or panic will start to engage the prefrontal cortex, give some element of control back to the individual so that they know what is the one thing that I need to do right now. We teach them to manage their stress response through tactical breathing. Breathing is one of those things that's both voluntary and involuntary. We breathe over 20,000 times a day. So if we can engage voluntarily the rate of our breathing, we can impact both the emotions that we're experiencing as well as the physiological response to stressors. Using visualization to help anticipate challenges and how we're going to overcome them. Self-talk is a big one. As I mentioned, we speak to ourselves quite frequently. Most of that is negative. So learning some very simple strategies to identify that and change what we're saying, because we're the only beings that can enact the fight, flight, or freeze response simply by what we're saying to ourselves inside of our head. If you've ever, if you have pets at home, they don't do that. They don't freak out over something that has never happened. We always come up with these worst case scenarios, and we can actually produce cortisol and adrenaline sitting here in the room with nothing dangerous actually happening, except maybe running out of coffee. And then teaching people about attention control and fine-tuning their ability to focus their attention either on a wide variety of things and scan the environment continually, or focus on one thing for an extended period of time. And this is where emotion comes in. And just a quick difference, the difference between feeling and emotion. Feeling, it's all the physical sensations we feel that we then interpret and they become emotion. So that's the expression of the feeling. And those processes will change our thoughts, will change a lot of physiological processes, our breathing, heart rate, temperature, our body language, our vocal tones. So other people will be able to see it in us. And it will initiate one of two different behavioral responses, either an approach response or an avoidance response. So important to be aware of what we're actually feeling. We're fundamentally emotional creatures, and it's important that we start to become more comfortable with the fact that our emotions are actually first-line intelligence, that there's something in our environment we need to pay attention to. You know, they help us to make sense of life, and they're an integral part of our decision-making. When we're having negative emotions, we're much more likely to have harsh decision-making. There's actually research that shows that teachers, if they're angry or in a bad mood, will actually mark a grade and a half lower on the same paper that if they're in a much better mood, that they would mark a grade and a half higher. So I think my children have learned how to leverage that to their advantage. They now ask questions after I go for a run instead of before. And if we fail to acknowledge the emotions that we're feeling, there's going to be a bit of a disconnect, and we may be actually making the wrong decisions if we're not paying attention to what those emotions are. So they're the filter between us and the world around us. So a simple difference between if we see something as a threat, it will narrow our attention, draw our attention to a problem that needs to be solved immediately, which is very important for our survival. We don't want to override that. But if we see it as an opportunity, that may actually broaden our mind. We'll see more solutions, and we'll be much more likely to engage in, you know, to receive feedback from others, to be more creative and more willing to listen. So again, if we can actually change our perception from seeing a situation as a threat to seeing it as a challenge, we'll produce less cortisol and adrenaline. We'll be more open and creative and much more likely to find a solution that fits. I mean, there are other things that play a role in this as well. Our genetics, our experience, our training, our memories. And training is key in this. And we heard yesterday about the importance of the experience of failure. Training failure will actually create an emotional bookmark that will help us avoid choosing that COA in the future without us even necessarily being aware of it. So the ongoing experience of failure in a safe training environment is actually very, very important to increasing the speed of decision making later on in you know, more stressful and perhaps chaotic situations. So what is emotional fitness? Well, the ability to recognize the emotion we're feeling. If I'm clenching my fist, you know, my jaw's tight, my shoulders are tight. Am I angry? Am I frustrated? Am I sad? Increasing our emotional literacy. And then figuring out what is it that's actually causing me to feel that way so that I can, one, express it appropriately, because one of our, if we're not actually paying attention to our emotions, we're all likely to have inappropriate expression of emotion. And I, for one, can say that on more than one occasion I've hit send before I should have because I was reacting to my emotions and not necessarily recognizing what I needed to do. And so one of the key things about emotional fitness is accepting our emotions. And our society hasn't necessarily socialized us for that. And the more energy that we put into suppressing our emotions, it's like squeezing a balloon. It has to go somewhere. So if we can accept the emotions that we're feeling, become more aware of them, and naming our emotions is key. And this is where emotional literacy comes in. If we can name the emotion, it actually decreases the intensity of the emotion we're feeling simply by labeling it and saying, okay, I'm angry. Now what do I need to do about it? And this is kind of our level of emotional literacy these days. So if I were to ask you what the difference between anger and disappointment is, it's a hard one to identify. And I would suggest that we don't necessarily learn this vocabulary. So anger is because of injustice, unfairness, or a perceived violation of our rights. And disappointment is unmet expectations. again, they will have very different strategies to resolve them and to problem solve. But if we can't actually name the emotion, we may use an inappropriate strategy or a solution that doesn't fit. So perhaps we want to go from this to this. And yes, well, this is a little bit overwhelming, and I put this in my presentation a year ago at the Army Individual Training Authority Conference, more just to highlight that there's a wide variety of emotions. But I spoke with Colonel Mike Sullivan about a month after that, and he said, "Hey, Suzanne, do you have a higher resolution copy of this?" And I thought, wow, I never thought a combat arms officer would be asking me for the wheel of emotions. But he said that the first time he heard me present it, he actually printed it off, and when somebody would come into his office all wound up, he would actually take a minute or two to sit down with them and identify the emotion they were feeling and help them to identify the solution they needed to take. And for those of you who know Mike Sullivan, only he could do something like this. But again, unlabeled emotions may lead to a misunderstanding and irrational choices, and research shows that only 36% of people can accurately identify the emotion they're experiencing as it occurs. And we also need to keep in mind the energy levels of emotions. There are some emotions that are high energy or low energy, as well as pleasant or unpleasant. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're either good or bad. There are certain times when, to be in that yellow quadrant, where we feel excitement and joy, we're looking forward to something. Those are important emotions to feel for certain tasks, but if we want to actually get ready for a competitive event, we might want to be in the red zone, where we're feeling a little bit of anxiety, perhaps some anger or frustration, or if we're trying to advocate for something that we think is important for our troops, we want to actually get ourselves into that red zone. In the green, tranquility, serenity, satisfaction. Again, if we want to actually be more creative problem solvers, if we want to think about the future and strategize, we want to get our emotional zone there. And then in the blue, sadness, boredom, despair, we become much more empathetic. We can identify with other people. We can understand what they're trying to express to us. So again, recognizing that they all have benefits, and we need to leverage where we are depending on what the objective is, and manage our time in each quadrant. So emotion regulation is the ability to influence the types of emotions we experience and how we express them, and then how we can use them to our advantage to enhance our performance. So if we want a competitive advantage or heightened awareness, again, as I mentioned, we want to get into a certain quadrant. If we want to have creative problem solving, focus or reasoning, critical analysis. Again, if you want to review something that's going to go up to your boss, you want to be in a zone where you're going to be a little bit negative so that you can find all the mistakes and correct them before you pass it up. So some of the skills that I talked about, the big four, can actually be leveraged to help us get into the zone that we need to be in. And I'm not going to go through that in detail. That's just for your benefit, an example of some of the emotions that are in each of those quadrants. And this work comes from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, which is headed by Dr. Mark Brackett, who's done a lot of work on teaching this to teachers so that they can actually implement it in schools, so that children growing up can actually have a much larger emotional vocabulary and build that emotional literacy in, so that they don't grow up, frustrated because they don't know what the emotions are that they're feeling or how to express them. So just to highlight that eventually the goal is emotional agility, so we can react appropriately to all of the situations that we find ourselves in. Keep our emotion regulation system in good working order, and this has to do with balance. I mean, we've talked about how we have to actually think about sleep, fitness, nutrition. The Yerkes-Dodson performance curve sits on a foundation of fitness, sleep, and nutrition. If we're in good physical condition, we will produce less cortisol and adrenaline when we're in highly stressful situations. If we feed ourselves healthy foods, our body has to do less adaptation in the digestive system to digest some of the chemicals in the more unhealthy foods. So if there's less adaptation required to eat healthy foods, we have more energy to use for other processes like keeping our brain functioning, because it's very energy hungry. reminding people that the ability to self-generate positive emotions is critical to resilience. So humor, social connection are all very important to making sure we have the ability to experience positive emotions and to keep that balance. And then over time, knowing that daily experiences of positive emotions will over time help us to build resilience and hopefully make us emotional superheroes.